What if the heaviest thing you carry every single day isn't your own pain, your own fear, or your own stress, but someone else's? What if the exhaustion you feel by the end of the day, the anxiety that creeps in for no clear reason, the sudden shift in your mood after a conversation you didn't even want to have? What if none of that was originally yours? What if you have been living for years inside a mental and emotional space that has been slowly colonized by the energy, the moods, the fears and the chaos of the people around you, and you never even noticed it happening? This is not a metaphor. This is not spiritual language. This is a psychological and neurological reality that science has confirmed and that most people will go their entire lives never understanding. The energy of other people affects your brain, your body, your nervous system, and your decisions in ways that are measurable, real, and deeply consequential. And if you have never learned how to protect yourself from it, you are not living your life. You are living a version of everyone else's life stitched together from fragments of their anxiety, their negativity, their unresolved wounds, and their unconscious chaos. This audiobook is about reclaiming what is yours. It is about understanding exactly how other people's energy infiltrates your mind. Why some people are far more susceptible to it than others. What it costs you every single day to absorb energy that was never meant for you. And most importantly, what you can do about it starting now. Every chapter of this audiobook is built on psychology, neuroscience, and the kind of ruthlessly honest self-examination that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. There is no fluff here, no vague inspiration, no empty reassurances. Just the truth about what is happening inside your mind and the precise tools you need to stop it. By the time you finish this audiobook, you will understand yourself in a way you never have before. You will know why certain people drain you completely. You will know why you walk into a room feeling fine and walk out feeling devastated. You will know how to build the kind of internal protection that does not require you to become cold, distant, or cruel, but that does require you to become the undisputed guardian of your own inner world. Your peace is not a luxury. It is not something you earn when life finally calms down. It is something you build, protect and defend every single day. And it starts right here. Chapter 1. The Invisible Force: Understanding Emotional Contagion. There is a phenomenon that scientists have studied for decades. One that explains why you feel anxious after spending an hour with a nervous friend. Why you leave certain family dinners feeling emotionally flattened. Why a single tense conversation with a coworker can derail your entire afternoon. It is called emotional contagion, and it is one of the most powerful, most overlooked forces shaping your daily mental state. Emotional contagion is the process by which you unconsciously absorb and replicate the emotional states of the people around you. It is not something you choose to do. It is not a sign of weakness or sensitivity. It is a deeply embedded biological mechanism wired into your nervous system long before you had any say in the matter. And unless you understand it, truly understand it, at the level of brain science, you will never be able to defend yourself against it. Here is how it works. Inside your brain, you have a network of specialized cells called mirror neurons. These neurons were first discovered in the early 1990s by Italian neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team, who were studying the brains of macaque monkeys. What they found was extraordinary. When a monkey performed a specific action, certain neurons in its brain fired. But when that same monkey watched another monkey perform that same action without doing anything itself, the exact same neurons fired. The brain was mirroring the experience of another being in real time, as if it were living it directly. Humans have an even more sophisticated version of this system. And it doesn't just apply to physical actions. It applies to emotions. When someone near you is terrified, your mirror neurons activate the neural patterns associated with fear in your own brain. When someone near you is deeply sad, your brain begins to simulate that sadness neurologically. When someone near you is vibrating with rage or anxiety or despair, your nervous system begins to echo it quietly, automatically, without your permission or your awareness. This is not poetic language. This is biology. You are at a neurological level constantly absorbing the emotional reality of the people around you. And the research makes this devastatingly clear. Psychologists Ella Hatfield, John Cacioppo, and Richard Rapson, pioneers in the study of emotional contagion, demonstrated through decades of research that humans synchronize facial expressions, vocal tones, postures, and physiological states with the people they interact with, often within fractions of a second. You do not decide to do this. It happens below the threshold of conscious awareness, deep in the automatic processing systems of your brain, before your rational mind has even registered that a conversation has begun. Now consider what this means for your daily life. Every interaction you have is an opportunity for emotional transfer. Every person you spend time with is broadcasting an emotional signal and your nervous system is receiving it. The question is not whether this is happening. It is. The question is how much of it are you absorbing? How much is accumulating inside you? And how much of your current emotional state is genuinely yours versus a residue of everyone else's inner turbulence that your nervous system picked up along the way? Think about the last time you had a deeply draining conversation with someone who was panicking, complaining, or drowning in negativity. You tried to help. You tried to stay calm. But something happened. Your shoulders tensed. Your breathing changed. Your thoughts started to race in directions they weren't heading before the conversation started. By the time it ended, you felt heavier, foggier, more anxious, not because anything in your life had changed, but because you had been exposed to someone else's nervous system in a state of high distress, and your brain had quietly done exactly what it was designed to do. Mirror it. This is the invisible force. It has been shaping your moods, your decisions, your energy levels, and your mental clarity every single day. And the first step to protecting yourself from it is to see it with absolute clarity. To name it, to understand it, and to stop dismissing it as something you were imagining or something you should be able to simply push past. You cannot push past a biological mechanism. You can only understand it well enough to manage it. And that is what this audiobook will teach you to do. The reason emotional contagion is so difficult to identify and defend against is that it doesn't feel like something is happening to you. It feels like something is happening inside you. There is no visible moment of transfer, no clear before and after. You simply find yourself feeling different, heavier, more anxious, more depleted. And because there's no obvious external cause, you assume it came from within. You blame yourself. You think something is wrong with you. You wonder why you can't hold it together. But you were never falling apart. You were absorbing. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Understanding emotional contagion is not about becoming paranoid about other people. It is not about cutting yourself off from human connection or treating every interaction like a threat. It is about developing what psychologists call emotional literacy. The ability to track your own internal state with enough precision that you can notice when it shifts. Identify what caused the shift and make a conscious choice about what you do with that information. That skill, which most people never develop, is the foundation of everything that follows in this audiobook. It is the beginning of your defense. Chapter 2. Why you feel it more. The science of emotional sensitivity. Not everyone is equally affected by emotional contagion. You have probably noticed this. Some people seem almost immune to the moods of those around them. They can sit with someone in crisis and remain completely steady. They can walk through a room full of tension and come out the other side untouched. They seem to have a natural insulation, a kind of emotional Teflon that prevents other people's chaos from sticking to them. And then there are people like you, people who feel everything more deeply, more intensely, more persistently. People who have always been told they are too sensitive, too emotional, too affected by things that shouldn't matter so much. People who absorb the room the moment they walk into it, who carry other people's pain home with them, who wake up in the morning already weighed down by residue they can't quite name. If this is you, the first thing you need to understand is that this is not a defect. This is not a sign that you are fragile or damaged or fundamentally unable to cope. It is a neurological reality, and it has both a cost and a profound value if you learn how to work with it rather than be consumed by it. Research in psychology and neuroscience has identified a genuine trait that explains why some people experience emotional contagion so much more intensely than others. Dr. Elaine Aron, a psychologist at Stony Brook University, spent decades researching what she called high sensitivity, eventually developing the concept of the highly sensitive person, or HSP. What she found was that roughly 15 to 20% of the population has a nervous system that processes sensory and emotional information more deeply than average. This is not a disorder. It is a genetic trait found not only in humans but in over 100 animal species, which tells you something important about its evolutionary value. Highly sensitive individuals process the world at a deeper level. They notice subtleties others miss. They feel the emotional undercurrents in a room before anyone else acknowledges them. They pick up on micro-expressions, shifts in tone, changes in atmosphere with an accuracy that can feel almost uncanny. But the cost of this depth of processing is that everything lands harder. The emotional signals from other people don't just register, they penetrate. They take up residence. They get processed and reprocessed in the nervous system long after the triggering interaction has ended. If you are a highly sensitive person, you are not imagining that other people's energy affects you more than it seems to affect everyone else. You are right, it does. Your nervous system is wired to receive emotional information with extraordinary precision. And without proper protection and awareness, that precision becomes a liability rather than a gift. But high sensitivity is not the only explanation. Beyond the HSP trait, there are other factors that determine how vulnerable you are to emotional contagion. One of the most significant is the state of your own nervous system. Research in psychophysiology has shown that when your autonomic nervous system is dysregulated, when you are chronically stressed, sleep-deprived, emotionally exhausted, or nutritionally depleted, your brain's capacity to maintain its own emotional state against external pressure drops dramatically. A dysregulated nervous system is essentially a nervous system without adequate defenses. It cannot hold its own signal steady when it is being bombarded by someone else's. It capitulates. It absorbs. It merges with whatever emotional frequency is most dominant in the environment. This is why you may notice that certain people drain you far more on days when you are already tired or overwhelmed than they do on days when you are rested and centered. The person hasn't changed, your internal resources have, and that distinction matters enormously because it tells you something critical. Protecting your peace is not just about managing other people. It is about managing yourself. It is about maintaining your nervous system in a state of regulation so that you have the internal resources to hold your own emotional ground when the world around you is in chaos. There is another factor that research consistently identifies as a major contributor to emotional vulnerability, and it is one that is deeply uncomfortable to confront. Unresolved emotional wounds. When you carry unhealed pain, whether from childhood, from past relationships, from trauma, from loss, your nervous system is already partially occupied. Part of your emotional and cognitive capacity is perpetually dedicated to managing, suppressing, or working around that unresolved material. This leaves you with fewer internal resources to regulate the emotional input coming from outside. Your boundaries, metaphorically speaking, are already under strain from the inside, and that makes it far easier for other people's energy to breach them. This is not something to feel ashamed of. Every human being carries wounds. But it is something you need to understand, because it means that protecting your peace is not just about the strategies you employ in your external life. It is also about the internal work you are willing to do, the healing, the processing, the gradual unburdening of the weight you have been carrying for years. You cannot fully protect a house that is already structurally compromised from within. The external walls matter, but so does the foundation. Understanding why you feel other people's energy so intensely is not just an intellectual exercise. It is the beginning of self-compassion. For years, perhaps your whole life, you have judged yourself for this. You have called yourself weak. You have tried to harden yourself, to care less, to shut down the very sensitivity that makes you perceptive, empathetic, and deeply human. And none of it worked because you were treating sensitivity as the enemy when it was never the problem. The problem was the absence of structure, of understanding, of skills, of deliberate internal protection. That is what changes now. Chapter 3. The Hidden Price. What absorbing other people's energy is actually costing you. There is a cost to living without protection. It is a cost most people pay every single day without ever seeing an itemized bill. It accumulates quietly, invisibly across thousands of interactions, hundreds of unguarded moments, years of absorbing emotional weight that was never yours to carry. And by the time most people start to notice something is wrong, the damage is already deep embedded in their health, their relationships, their sense of self, and their capacity to feel joy. The most immediate and visible cost is energy, not motivation, not enthusiasm, not drive, raw physical cellular energy. When your nervous system is constantly processing the emotional states of other people, it is working. It is burning resources. The brain is the most metabolically expensive organ in the human body. And emotional processing is among its most demanding functions. Every time you absorb someone else's anxiety, every time your mirror neurons fire in response to someone else's distress, every time your body's stress response is activated, not by your own situation, but by proximity to someone else's turbulence, you are paying a biological price. Cortisol is released. Adrenaline spikes. Your cardiovascular system responds. Your immune function is modulated. And when this happens chronically, not once, not occasionally, but day after day, in interaction after interaction, the cumulative physiological toll is significant. Research in psychoneuroimmunology, the science of how psychological states affect immune function, has demonstrated repeatedly that chronic social stress, including the stress of being emotionally dysregulated by exposure to others, suppresses immune activity, elevates inflammatory markers, disrupts sleep architecture, and accelerates cellular aging. This is not abstract. This means that the years you have spent absorbing other people's chaos have had a measurable impact on your physical body. The tiredness you feel that sleep doesn't fix. The vague sense of depletion that doesn't have a clear cause. The susceptibility to illness, the tension that lives permanently in your shoulders and your jaw and your chest. These are not signs that something is wrong with your body. They are signs that your body has been doing too much for too long, carrying a load it was never meant to sustain. But the physical cost, as significant as it is, may not be the most devastating one. The deeper cost is cognitive. When your nervous system is chronically burdened by the absorbed emotional states of others, your higher cognitive functions, the ones housed in the prefrontal cortex, responsible for clear thinking, rational decision, creativity, and long-term planning, are progressively impaired. The brain has a limited capacity for processing. And when a significant portion of that capacity is perpetually occupied by emotional regulation, by managing the residue of everyone else's moods, fears, and conflicts, there is simply less left over for thinking clearly, for being creative, for solving problems with precision and depth. This manifests in your life as a persistent mental fog, a difficulty concentrating that you can't fully explain, a feeling of being perpetually reactive rather than thoughtful. A sense that you are always behind, always catching up, never fully on top of things. Not because you are insufficiently intelligent or capable, but because your cognitive resources are stretched thin by the invisible work your nervous system is doing around the clock. You are not lazy. You are not scattered. You are depleted, and the depletion is coming from a source most people never think to examine. There is also a profound cost to your sense of identity. This is perhaps the most insidious consequence of long-term emotional absorption, because it happens so gradually that most people never notice it until they find themselves unable to answer a deceptively simple question. What do I actually feel? Not what does the person next to me feel? Not what does the room feel like? What do I myself in this moment feel? For people who have spent years without strong emotional boundaries, this question becomes genuinely difficult. Their inner landscape has been so thoroughly colonized by the emotional residue of others that they have lost reliable access to their own authentic emotional signals. They have trouble distinguishing their own desires from the expectations they've absorbed. Their own grief from the grief they've taken on, their own fear from the fear they've been marinating in for years. They don't know who they are anymore beneath the accumulated weight of everyone else's emotional world. Psychologists refer to this as enchantment, the blurring of psychological boundaries between self and other to a degree that compromises one's sense of individual identity. It is most commonly discussed in the context of family systems and romantic relationships. But it can occur in any context where emotional boundaries are absent, unclear, or chronically violated. And the consequence is not merely philosophical. It affects every decision you make, every relationship you form, every goal you pursue or abandon. When you do not have reliable access to your own authentic emotional experience, you are navigating your life without a compass. You are making choices based on a map of someone else's territory, wondering why you never seem to end up where you actually wanted to go. And then there is what this costs your relationships. Ironically, the people who absorb others' energy most readily, often the most empathetic, the most caring, the most attuned, frequently become the most resentful. Not because they are ungrateful or bitter by nature, but because the relentless unacknowledged work of emotional absorption eventually produces an internal debt that cannot be ignored. You give and give and give of your emotional bandwidth to friends, to family members, to colleagues, sometimes to strangers without any structure in place to replenish what is being depleted. And over time the resentment builds, the warmth becomes obligation. The generosity becomes exhaustion. And the very people you love begin to feel like sources of threat rather than sources of nourishment because every interaction costs you something you cannot afford to spend. The price of living without protection is enormous. It is paid in your health, your clarity, your identity, your joy, and your relationships. And none of it has to continue. But before you can change it, you have to be willing to look at it directly, to stop minimizing it. To stop telling yourself it isn't that bad, to stop waiting for it to get better on its own. It will not get better on its own. It will only change when you decide to change it. Chapter 4. Mapping the Drain. Identifying the people and environments that deplete you. Before you can protect your peace, you need to know precisely where and how it is being taken from you. This requires a level of honest self-observation that most people are never taught. From childhood, most of us are trained to focus outward to manage how we appear, how we perform, how we respond to others. The skill of turning that same quality of attention inward, of systematically mapping our own energy landscape with precision and honesty, is one that almost nobody is given, but it is one of the most powerful things you will ever develop. Let's be clear about what we are doing in this chapter. We are not building a case against anyone. We are not looking for villains or compiling a list of people to blame. What we are doing is something far more useful and far more honest. We are mapping reality. We are identifying with clarity and without judgment where your energy is going, what is taking it, and what the patterns are that allow it to be taken. Without this map, everything else in this audiobook is just theory. With it you have something you can actually act on. Begin with people. Think specifically and concretely about the individuals in your life and how you feel in the hours during and after spending time with them. Not in the abstract concretely. There are people in your life who, after you spend time with them, leave you feeling energized, clear-headed, and like a fuller version of yourself. And there are people after whom you feel drained, foggy, irritable, anxious, or strangely sad without knowing why. Both categories matter. But right now, focus on the second. Who are the specific individuals who consistently, not occasionally, but consistently leave your energy lower than they found it? Research in social psychology distinguishes between what are often called energy givers and energy drains. But the science behind these categories is more precise than the labels suggest. Studies examining the physiological effects of different social interactions, measuring cortisol levels, heart rate variability, and immune markers before and after have consistently found that certain types of social interactions produce measurable biological stress responses while others produce the opposite. It is not imagination. It is chemistry, and the patterns that produce the stress response tend to cluster into recognizable types. The first type is the chronic complainer. This is the person for whom every conversation is a litany of grievance about their health, their circumstances, their relationships, their bad luck, their impossible situation. They are not always conscious of what they are doing. Often they genuinely feel overwhelmed and are reaching out in the only way they know how. But the effect on you is consistent. After extended exposure to sustained negativity and helplessness, your own nervous system begins to mirror those states. Your stress response is activated. Your hope and motivation are subtly corroded. And you walk away not only depleted but dimmer than you were before, as if some of your internal light has been absorbed into their darkness. The second type is the crisis generator. The person whose life is always in emergency mode, who pulls you into the urgency and chaos of their situation at any hour, who makes their crisis your responsibility, and who has an almost uncanny ability to make you feel guilty for having boundaries or for not being perpetually available. What makes this type particularly draining is that the emotional intensity is real. Their crises often are genuine, but the pattern in which they are perpetually in crisis, perpetually drawing others in to manage it, and making no sustainable progress towards stability is what matters. One crisis is human. An unending series of crises that always requires your emotional labor is a dynamic. And dynamics have patterns that you are allowed to recognize and respond to strategically. The third type is the covert negativist. This is the person who doesn't complain overtly but who emits a consistent low-frequency signal of cynicism, pessimism, criticism, and subtle undermining. They comment on your plans in ways that leave doubt behind. They respond to your good news with a kind of muted lukewarmness. They have a gift for finding the flaw in every idea, the risk in every opportunity, the shadow behind every light. Over time, the effect of sustained exposure to this energy is a gradual dimming of your own confidence, enthusiasm, and sense of possibility. Not through any dramatic incident but through the slow, steady accumulation of small negations. The fourth type is the emotional volcano. The person whose moods are extreme, unpredictable and intense, and whose emotional state dominates every environment they enter. When they are happy, everyone is expected to be happy. When they are angry, everyone walks on eggshells. When they are in pain, all available emotional bandwidth in the room is directed toward them. Living or working in proximity to an emotional volcano requires your nervous system to be in a state of constant readiness, perpetually scanning for the next eruption, perpetually calibrating your behavior to manage the environment. This chronic hypervigilance is exhausting at a neurological level, and it leaves you with nothing. Now look at your environments. Not just the people, but the physical and social spaces you inhabit. Some environments are structured in ways that continuously generate emotional drain. Workplaces defined by competition, gossip, and chronic stress. Family systems organized around unspoken conflict and unresolved pain. Social circles where performance and approval drive every interaction. Your nervous system responds to these environmental signals just as it responds to individual people. The energy of a place is real. The atmosphere of a workplace is real. The emotional weather of a family gathering is real. And if you are spending significant hours of your life in environments that are fundamentally dysregulating, the cumulative effect is the same as spending those hours with a single chronically draining person. Once you have your map, the people, the environments, the patterns, something important happens. You can no longer pretend you don't know. You can no longer tell yourself it isn't that bad, or that you are imagining it, or that it will change on its own. The map is not a judgment. It is information, and information is the beginning of choice. What you do with this map, how you adjust your exposure, your responses, your internal strategies is what the rest of this audiobook is about. But you cannot adjust what you have not first honestly seen. Chapter 5. Boundaries are not walls. The truth about emotional protection. There is perhaps no concept more misunderstood, more feared and more poorly defined in the modern conversation about mental health and relationships than the concept of boundaries. The word itself has become so overused, so diluted and so freighted with misunderstanding that for many people it has lost almost all practical meaning. Some people hear the word and think immediately of rejection, of coldness, of the kind of distance that damages relationships and closes people off from love and connection. Others think of it as something aggressive, a declaration of war disguised as self-care. And still others want desperately to have boundaries but have no concrete idea what that actually means in practice. What it looks like, how it feels, what you actually do or say or decide when you are trying to establish one. This chapter is going to give you the truth about emotional boundaries. Not the vague inspirational version, not the defensive fearful version, but the psychologically precise version. Because until you understand what a boundary actually is and is not, you cannot build one that works. Let's start with what a boundary is not. A boundary is not a wall. A wall is a permanent undiscriminating barrier designed to keep everything out equally. Walls don't protect your peace. They imprison you in isolation. A person who lives behind walls doesn't have good boundaries. They have fear. They have learned that closeness is dangerous and that the only way to be safe is to prevent meaningful contact altogether. That is not the goal of emotional protection. The goal is not to stop feeling, not to stop connecting, and not to stop being affected by the people and the world around you. The goal is to choose how you are affected. To what degree and for how long. A boundary properly understood is a structure of discernment. It is the internal and external framework through which you manage what you allow into your psychological and emotional space, how long you allow it to remain there, and what you do when something enters that shouldn't. The operative word in that definition is manage, not prevent, not block, manage. Because a truly healthy boundary is not a locked gate. It is a gate with a hinge that you control. You decide what comes in, when, and how much. You decide when the gate opens and when it closes. You are the one holding the mechanism, not other people, not your history, not your fear of disappointing someone. Psychology distinguishes between several types of boundaries that operate simultaneously in our lives. Physical boundaries determine what contact and proximity you are comfortable with. Time boundaries determine how much of your time you make available to others and under what conditions. Emotional boundaries, which are the focus of this audiobook, determine how much of your inner emotional world you allow to be shaped by the emotional worlds of others. And it is important to understand that emotional boundaries are not the same as emotional walls. An emotional boundary does not mean that you stop caring. It does not mean that you stop feeling empathy or compassion. What it means is that you develop the capacity to feel with someone without feeling as them, to be present to their pain, without becoming subsumed by it, to witness their chaos without importing it into your own nervous system. This distinction between feeling with and feeling is the psychological heart of emotional protection. Research on empathy consistently distinguishes between two fundamentally different modes of engaging with others' emotional states. The first is empathic resonance. The experience of genuinely feeling what someone else is feeling, of having your nervous system mirror their experience so completely that their pain becomes your pain, their anxiety becomes your anxiety, their fear becomes your fear. This is the mode that most emotionally sensitive people default to, and it is the mode that without proper management leads directly to the depletion, the loss of identity and the exhaustion described in previous chapters. The second mode is empathic concern. The capacity to understand and care about what someone is feeling without neurologically replicating that feeling inside your own body. This is the mode that allows a skilled therapist to sit with someone in profound grief for 50 minutes, session after session, and remain genuinely compassionate without becoming devastated themselves. It is the mode that allows an emergency room physician to remain clear-headed and decisive while caring deeply about the patient in crisis in front of them. This mode is not emotional distance. It is emotional mastery, and it is learnable. The research of Dr. Tina Singer, a neuroscientist at the Max Planck Institute, has been particularly illuminating on this distinction. Through neuroimaging studies, Singer and her colleagues demonstrated that empathic resonance and empathic concern activate different neural circuits, and that the circuits associated with empathic concern, particularly those involving activation of the insula and anterior cingulate cortex in conjunction with strong regulatory input from the prefrontal cortex, are associated with pro-social motivation and compassion without the physiological distress and burnout associated with pure resonance. In other words, the science shows us that it is neurologically possible to care deeply without suffering, alongside that the most functional form of empathy is not the most total form, and that protecting yourself from emotional contagion is not a betrayal of compassion. It is actually the condition that makes sustainable compassion possible. This is a profound reframe. Many people who struggle to set emotional limits do so because they believe at some deep level that fully absorbing other people's pain is a demonstration of love. That if they truly care, they should feel everything. That protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm is somehow selfish, a withdrawal of genuine care in favor of personal comfort. But this belief, however common and however sincere, is simply not accurate. A candle that burns from both ends to light a room for others burns out. A person who gives everything, every reserve of emotional capacity to others without maintaining any internal structure to protect and replenish themselves, eventually becomes unable to give anything at all. The burnout is not a failure of caring. It is the inevitable arithmetic of depletion without replenishment. Building emotional boundaries then is not an act of caring less. It is an act of caring sustainably. It is the recognition that you cannot pour from an empty vessel, and that the most genuinely loving thing you can do for the people in your life is to remain whole, remain present, and remain capable of genuine connection. That wholeness requires protection, not walls, not coldness, not distance, but the deliberate, conscious, non-negotiable maintenance of your own inner ground. The refusal to allow that ground to be overrun by anyone else's chaos, however much you love them. This is the foundation on which everything else that follows in this audiobook is built. Once you understand that boundaries are not the opposite of love, but rather the precondition for sustainable love. Once you understand that protecting your peace is not selfishness, but self-preservation in the most profound sense, everything changes. The guilt loses its grip. The fear of disappointing people becomes manageable. The chronic overextension begins to seem not like generosity but like what it actually is. A failure to take yourself seriously enough to protect what is precious. Your peace is precious, and you are allowed more than allowed. You are obligated to yourself to protect it. Chapter 6. The Art of Detachment. How to stay present without being consumed. There is a quality that the most emotionally grounded people in the world share. It is not that they feel less. It is not that they care less. It is not that they have somehow managed to switch off the part of themselves that registers the pain and chaos of the world around them. What they have developed through practice and through understanding is the capacity to be fully present with someone without being psychologically swallowed by them. They can sit across from suffering and not dissolve into it. They can hear anger without becoming angry. They can witness anxiety without becoming anxious. This quality has a name. It is called detachment, and it is one of the most misunderstood and most essential skills you will ever develop. When most people hear the word detachment, they think of coldness. They think of someone who doesn't care, who is emotionally unavailable, who keeps people at arm's length as a mechanism of self-protection rooted in fear or incapacity. But this is a fundamental misreading of what detachment actually means in the psychological and philosophical traditions where it has been most carefully studied. True detachment is not the absence of care. It is care without possession. It is presence without merger. It is the ability to be genuinely, warmly, attentively with someone while simultaneously maintaining a clear, stable sense of where you end and where they begin. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome were among the first to articulate this principle with precision. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal the text that would become the Meditations, returned again and again to the idea that the external world, including the behavior and emotional states of other people, has no inherent power over the state of your inner life unless you grant it that power. This was not callousness. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor dealing with war, plague, political betrayal, and the deaths of people he loved. His detachment was not the detachment of someone who felt nothing. It was the hard-won discipline of someone who had learned to feel everything without being ruled by it. The distinction is everything. Modern psychology has arrived at the same insight through a very different route. The concept of differentiation of self developed by psychiatrist Murray Bowen in the mid-19th century and extensively refined since describes the capacity to remain psychologically distinct from others even in the context of close emotionally charged relationships. A well-differentiated person can be in contact with someone who is highly distressed without automatically absorbing that distress into their own emotional system. They can acknowledge the other person's reality without making it their own. They can be moved without being swept away. Bowen identified differentiation as one of the most important markers of emotional maturity, and decades of subsequent research have supported that assessment, showing that higher differentiation is associated with better mental health, more stable relationships, greater resilience, and lower susceptibility to emotional contagion. The practical question, of course, is how do you develop this capacity? How do you train yourself to be present without being consumed, to care without merging? To remain yourself in the presence of someone whose emotional intensity is pulling at you with tremendous force? The answer has several components and they work together. The first is what psychologists call observer stance. When you are in an emotionally charged interaction, your default tendency is to be fully inside the experience, feeling it, responding to it, being shaped by it in real time. Observer stance means developing the ability to simultaneously be in the experience and watch yourself being in it. It means cultivating a part of your awareness that remains slightly outside the moment, observing your own emotional reactions with curiosity rather than being completely fused with them. This is not dissociation. It is not numbness. It is the development of what is sometimes called the witness self. The part of your consciousness that can notice what you are feeling without being entirely defined by what you are feeling. Neuroscience supports this approach. Research on mindfulness-based practices, which have been studied extensively over the past 3 decades, has demonstrated that training the observer stance, the capacity to notice your own mental states with non-judgmental awareness, produces measurable changes in the brain, including increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for top-down emotional regulation, and decreased reactivity in the amygdala, the region responsible for the automatic fear and threat response. In other words, training yourself to observe your own reactions rather than simply having them builds neural architecture that makes emotional absorption significantly less automatic and significantly more manageable. The second component is what is sometimes called grounding. Maintaining a clear felt sense of your own body and your own physical presence during emotionally charged interactions when you are absorbing someone else's energy. One of the most reliable signs is that you lose yourself. Your sense of your own physical boundaries blurs. Your internal compass goes offline and you start navigating entirely by the emotional signals of the other person rather than your own. Deliberately returning your attention to your own body, feeling your feet on the floor, noticing your breath. Sensing the weight and boundaries of your physical form is not a distraction. It is a recalibration. It is a way of reminding your nervous system that you exist as a separate entity with your own internal reference point that cannot be dissolved by someone else's emotional weather. The third component is intentional compassion rather than automatic resonance. When someone near you is in pain or distress, your instinct, especially if you are highly sensitive, is to match their emotional frequency, to go to where they are. Intentional compassion involves a conscious choice to remain at your own emotional frequency while extending warmth and care in the direction of theirs. You are not climbing down into their pit. You are standing at the edge, reaching a hand down and holding yourself steady so that you can actually help rather than simply joining them in the overwhelm. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological reality. A regulated nervous system in the presence of a dysregulated one has an actual calming influence. Your steadiness is a gift to them. Your dissolution into their distress is not detachment practiced properly as one of the most loving things you can offer another person. It means you are present enough to truly see them, grounded enough to remain yourself while seeing them, and clear-headed enough to actually be useful rather than simply reactive. It is not distance. It is precision, and it is perhaps more than any other single skill, the one that will most transform your experience of other people's energy. Not by reducing your sensitivity to it, but by giving you mastery over what you do with it once it lands. Chapter 7. Recognizing the patterns, how draining dynamics sustain themselves. One of the most disorienting things about finding yourself repeatedly depleted by the same people, the same dynamics and the same types of interactions is the sense that you should know better by now. You have been through this before. You have felt this exact particular kind of exhaustion after this exact particular kind of encounter. You have told yourself more than once that something has to change. And yet here you are again, having given more than you had, feeling worse than you did before, wondering why you keep ending up in the same place. The answer to that question is not that you are weak or foolish or incapable of learning. The answer is that the dynamics that drain you are in most cases self-sustaining systems, and without understanding how those systems work, you cannot disrupt them no matter how clearly you see them. Psychologists who study relational dynamics have long recognized that the most persistently draining patterns in human relationships are not random. They follow recognizable structures, structures that have internal logic, that reward certain behaviors and punish others, that actively resist change, and that tend to pull all participants back toward the established pattern even when one or more of those participants genuinely want something different. Understanding these structures is not about assigning blame. It is about developing the system's level awareness that allows you to see not just the most recent incident but the whole architecture of the dynamic, and to understand where and how it can be interrupted. The most foundational of these structures is what family systems theory calls the pursuer-distancer dynamic. In this pattern, one person in a relationship consistently moves toward the other, seeking more closeness, more communication, more emotional engagement, more connection, while the other consistently moves away, withdrawing, going quiet, becoming unavailable in the face of that pursuit. What makes this dynamic so exhausting for the pursuer is that the withdrawal feels like rejection. And the natural response to rejection is to pursue more intensely. But the more intensely the pursuer pursues, the more overwhelmed the distancer feels, and the further they withdraw, the system feeds itself. The pursuer gives more and more and receives less and less. Not because the distancer is malicious, but because the dynamic is pulling both people into their respective corners with a gravitational force that neither fully understands. If you recognize yourself as a habitual pursuer, someone who consistently overinvests in relationships where the other person is chronically unavailable, emotionally withholding, or reliably unable to meet you where you are, you are not in love with a difficult person. You are caught in a dynamic. And the most important thing to understand about that dynamic is that trying harder, giving more, being more understanding, being more patient will not change it. It will deepen it. The only intervention that works is changing your own position in the system, not as punishment to the other person, but as a genuine disruption of the pattern that is consuming your energy. Another structure that sustains chronic depletion is what researchers call the overfunctioner-underfunctioner dynamic. In this pattern, one person consistently does more than their share, more emotional labor, more problem solving, more caretaking, more crisis management, while the other person consistently does less, functioning below their actual capacity because someone else has reliably taken responsibility for filling the gap. The overfunctioner is typically driven by anxiety, a deep, often unconscious belief that if they stop holding everything together, everything will fall apart. The underfunctioner is typically comfortable in a role that, whatever its costs, relieves them of responsibility and demand. And again, the system sustains itself because the very behavior of the overfunctioner enables and reinforces the underfunctioning of the other. If you are an overfunctioner, and many of the people most vulnerable to emotional depletion are, you may have told yourself for years that you are simply irresponsible, caring person who steps up when others won't. And that may be true. But it may also be worth asking yourself whether your overfunctioning is partly a defense against the anxiety of allowing others to manage their own lives, make their own mistakes, and find their own way through their own difficulties. The discomfort of stepping back, of allowing someone to struggle without immediately rushing in to help, can feel unbearable when overfunctioning has become your default mode. But that discomfort is the feeling of a dynamic being disrupted, and disruption is exactly what is needed. There is also the pattern of emotional rescuing, the compulsive need to fix, soothe, and resolve other people's distress as quickly as possible. Not only because you care about them, but because their distress is intolerable to you. The emotional rescuer absorbs other people's pain so urgently and so completely that the boundary between helping and merging dissolves entirely. They cannot sit with someone else's discomfort without trying to eliminate it. Cannot allow a friend to be sad without immediately mobilizing every available resource to make them feel better. Cannot tolerate the silence or the helplessness that sometimes is the most honest and present response to someone else's pain. This urgency, while it looks like compassion, is often driven by the rescuer's own discomfort with emotional pain rather than purely by care for the other person. And it costs them enormously because you cannot rescue everyone. And the attempt to do so drains a kind of energy that does not replenish easily. Understanding why these patterns sustain themselves is liberating. Not because it provides instant solutions, but because it removes the mystification. When you can see the system, when you can recognize that you are not just dealing with a difficult person, but participating in a self-reinforcing dynamic, you can stop trying to change the other person, which rarely works, and start changing your own position within the system, which always changes the dynamic in some way. You cannot control other people. You never could, but you have always had the power to change where you stand. And changing where you stand is often all it takes to shift a dynamic that has been consuming your energy for years. Chapter 8. Rebuilding from Within. The Practice of Mental Sovereignty. There is a concept that sits at the very center of everything this audiobook is asking you to build, and it deserves to be named directly. That concept is mental sovereignty. It is the state in which your inner world, your thoughts, your emotional baseline, your sense of who you are and what matters to you is governed primarily by you rather than by the people, circumstances, and energies that surround you. Not governed perfectly, not governed without influence from the outside world, which is neither possible nor desirable, but governed by you, anchored in you, rooted deeply enough in your own values, your own self-awareness, and your own internal practices that it cannot be toppled by the next difficult conversation, the next draining relationship, or the next wave of someone else's chaos. Most people have never lived in a state of mental sovereignty. They have lived instead in a state of constant reactivity. Their internal experience shaped almost entirely by external inputs. Their mood a mirror of the social atmosphere around them. Their sense of themselves fluctuating based on the last thing someone said to them or the last emotional climate they were immersed in. They mistake this reactive state for normal. They assume that the degree to which the outside world controls their inner experience is simply how life works. That only extraordinary people, monks or stoics, get to decide how they feel, and that for ordinary people, feelings just happen to you based on what happens to you. This assumption is false, and disproving it not just intellectually but in practice in the felt reality of your daily life is what rebuilding from within is about. The first pillar of mental sovereignty is self-knowledge. You cannot govern what you do not understand. The most vulnerable people, energetically speaking, are not the most sensitive. They are the most unknowing. They have not developed a clear, detailed, honest map of their own interior, their triggers, their patterns, their characteristic responses under stress, the specific kinds of interactions that deplete them versus the ones that restore them. The fears and needs that drive their behavior in ways they are only dimly aware of. Without that map, every new situation is a surprise. Every emotional reaction feels like something happening to them, and every draining dynamic catches them off guard. Developing self-knowledge is a practice, not an event. It requires the habit of honest self-reflection. Not rumination, not self-criticism, not the kind of endless internal spinning that goes nowhere, but genuine, curious, non-judgmental inquiry into your own experience. What happened in that interaction that left me feeling so depleted? What was the trigger, the specific moment when I felt myself lose ground? What need of mine was being activated? What fear? What old story? These questions asked consistently and answered honestly over time build a map of your interior that is more valuable than any external strategy for protecting your peace because it allows you to see the threat before it has already landed. The second pillar is what psychologists call internal locus of control. The degree to which you attribute what happens in your life, particularly your emotional experience, to your own choices and responses rather than to external forces. Research consistently shows that people with a strong internal locus of control are more psychologically resilient, more emotionally stable, and less susceptible to the kind of chronic emotional absorption we have been discussing throughout this audiobook. They are not people who deny that external events affect them. They are people who have internalized the understanding that while they cannot always control what happens to them, they can always in some measure, however small, control how they respond. And that gap between stimulus and response is where their freedom lies. Building a stronger internal locus of control is not about adopting a toxic positivity that denies difficulty. It is about consistently, deliberately asking a different question. Not what is being done to me, but what can I do about this? Not why does this always happen to me, but what is my role in this pattern? And what can I change? The shift from victim of circumstances to agent in circumstances is not a matter of personality. It is a matter of practice. And every time you practice it, every time you choose to look for your own agency in a situation, rather than immediately looking for what or who to blame, you are building the neural pathways that make mental sovereignty increasingly natural rather than effortful. The third pillar is what could be called an anchor practice. A daily ritual that consistently returns you to your own center, your own signal, your own internal reference point. For some people, this is meditation. For others, it is physical exercise, journaling, time in nature, prayer, or creative work. The specific form matters less than its consistency and its function, which is to give your nervous system a daily experience of operating from its own center rather than from the reactive edge of contact with the world. Research on the neuroscience of habit and self-regulation is unambiguous on this point. The nervous system learns what it practices. A nervous system that is given a daily experience of stillness, of self-directed attention, of operating from a calm and grounded internal state, gradually becomes a nervous system that returns to that state more readily even under pressure. It is training and the results are cumulative in ways that are both measurable and profound. The fourth pillar is the deliberate protection of your mental inputs. What you allow into your mind on a sustained daily basis shapes your mental state with a consistency and a power that most people grossly underestimate. If your daily inputs, the conversations you have, the media you consume, the social environments you move through, the content that fills your attention for hours every day are predominantly negative, fear-based, conflict-laden, or energetically chaotic, your nervous system will reflect that. You cannot spend hours each day marinating in the emotional frequencies of fear, outrage, drama, and despair and expect to maintain a stable, peaceful, sovereign inner world. What you feed your mind is what your mind becomes. And taking deliberate, intentional control of those inputs, even partially, even gradually, is one of the most direct and powerful interventions available to you. Mental sovereignty is not a destination you arrive at. It is a direction you choose and a practice you sustain. But the difference between living with it and living without it is not subtle. It is the difference between experiencing your inner life as something that belongs to you that you inhabit with agency and intention and experiencing it as a surface that everything lands on and shapes without your say. You were born with an interior world that is yours alone. Reclaiming it is not selfishness. It is the most fundamental act of self-respect available to you. Chapter 9. The Language of Protection. How to communicate your limits without losing yourself. Every piece of internal work you do, every shift in awareness, every new understanding of your patterns. Every practice of detachment and groundedness and self-knowledge must eventually meet the external world. It must meet real people, real conversations, real moments in which someone is doing something that violates your peace and you have to decide what to say. This is where many people's progress stalls. The internal shift can feel relatively manageable in solitude. But the moment a difficult person is in front of them, demanding something or doing something or simply existing in a way that triggers every old pattern, everything they have learned seems to evaporate. They default. They overexplain or they go silent. They apologize when they have done nothing wrong or they erupt in a way that damages the relationship and leaves them feeling worse. They say yes when they mean no, or they say no in a way that sounds like an attack. The gap between knowing what you need and being able to communicate it clearly and without damage is a real and important gap. And this chapter is about closing it. The first thing to understand about communicating your emotional limits is that most people do it wrong for the same reason. They explain too much. They feel that in order for their no to be legitimate, it must be accompanied by extensive justification, by evidence, by precedent, by a detailed case that the other person will hopefully find reasonable and accept. But this approach almost always backfires. The moment you begin justifying, you have implicitly opened the floor to debate. You have suggested that your limit is conditional. That if the other person can find a flaw in your reasoning or offer a counterargument sufficient to outweigh your justification, the limit might be renegotiated. And people who are in the habit of overrunning other people's limits are often very skilled at exactly that kind of negotiation. A limit does not require justification. It requires clarity. There is a radical simplicity to a clearly stated limit that neither attacks nor apologizes, that simply states what is and is not acceptable to you as a fact about yourself rather than as a verdict about the other person. The difference in language is subtle, but the difference in effect is enormous. Compare these two responses to a friend who has just spent 45 minutes catastrophizing about a situation they have been catastrophizing about for months. The first response says, "I really think you're making this worse than it needs to be, and you've been going around in circles with this for so long," which is frustrated and evaluative and almost certain to produce defensiveness. The second says, "I care about you and I'm finding this conversation really draining for me. I think we need to talk about something else for a while." The second response says something true about the speaker's experience. It owns that experience completely. It makes no claim about the other person's behavior being wrong. And it states clearly what needs to happen next. This is the language of self-disclosure rather than accusation. Psychologists call it first-person communication. The practice of framing your limits and needs in terms of your own experience rather than the other person's behavior. Not "you always do this, but I'm finding this really hard." Not "you're being toxic, but I need some space from this dynamic." Not "you're exhausting me but I don't have the energy for this conversation right now." The difference is not just diplomatic. It is structurally important because it removes the other person from the position of defendant, which makes them far less likely to become defensive, and it keeps you in the position of the authority on your own experience, which is the only position you can actually defend. The second element of protective communication is learning to tolerate the discomfort that follows a clearly stated limit. Because that discomfort will come when you say no to someone who is accustomed to hearing yes from you. There will be a reaction. It may be overt frustration, hurt, pressure, argument. It may be subtler, a long silence, a withdrawal, a shift in their tone that feels like punishment. And your nervous system, conditioned by years of absorbing other people's emotional reactions, will immediately interpret that reaction as a signal that you have done something wrong and that you should fix it. The urge to walk back the limit, to soften it, to apologize, to overexplain will be powerful. You must learn to sit with that urge without obeying it. This is not cruelty. It is not indifference. It is the recognition that other people's discomfort with your limits is information about them, not evidence that your limits are wrong. People who have genuinely respected limits their entire lives barely notice when another person sets one. They may feel disappointed. They may express that, but they do not collapse. They do not punish, and they do not apply sustained pressure in an attempt to restore the previous arrangement. The intensity of someone's reaction to your limit is often proportional to how much they have depended on your absence of limits to meet their own needs, which tells you something important about the dynamic you were in and why it needed to change. The third element is consistency. A limit stated once and then abandoned under pressure teaches the other person that your limits are negotiable. That sufficient emotional pressure will restore the previous status quo and that your no is really a yes that hasn't been persuaded yet. This is one of the most common ways that well-intentioned attempts to protect one's peace fail, not because the person didn't know what they needed, but because they couldn't hold their position when it was tested. A limit that is stated consistently, that is maintained even when maintaining it is uncomfortable, that does not expand or contract based on the other person's reaction, is a genuine limit. Everything else is a request, and requests can be declined. You do not need to be harsh to be consistent. You do not need to be cold or distant or aggressive or clinical. The most effective protective communication in the world can be delivered with genuine warmth and care. The warmth is for the person. The clarity is for yourself. Both can coexist in the same sentence. And when they do, something remarkable often happens. The people in your life who are capable of genuine respect begin to relate to you differently, with more care, more consideration, and often with a kind of quiet relief, because they can feel that they are finally dealing with someone who is actually present rather than perpetually accommodating, and that the relationship they are in is real. Chapter 10. The Power of Solitude: Using Alone Time to Recalibrate Your Inner World. End. In a culture that treats productivity as the highest virtue and busyness as a mark of importance, solitude has been radically devalued. It is treated at best as a luxury, something to be indulged occasionally when everything else is done, a recharge between episodes of real life. At worst, it is treated as a symptom of loneliness, of social failure, of an inability to thrive in the relentless company of others. We live in a world that fills every available silence with stimulation, that treats the space between inputs as something to be eliminated rather than something to be cultivated. And that has made the experience of genuinely being alone with one's own mind so unfamiliar that many people find it actively uncomfortable. If you are someone whose peace is chronically threatened by other people's energy, this cultural devaluation of solitude is a serious problem. Because solitude is not a luxury for someone in your situation. It is a necessity. It is the single most reliable mechanism available to you for recalibrating your own internal state, clearing out the emotional residue of accumulated social exposure and returning to contact with your own signal. The authentic internal emotional and cognitive experience that is yours before anyone else's energy has had a chance to layer over it. The neuroscience here is compelling research on the default mode network, the brain system that activates during periods of quiet undirected mental activity when the mind is not processing external demands but is instead turned inward, has revealed that this system plays a central role in self-referential processing, autobiographical memory consolidation, and the integration of emotional experience. In simpler terms, the brain uses periods of solitude and quiet to process what has happened, to consolidate understanding, to sort through accumulated emotional material, and to restore a coherent sense of self. When solitude is chronically absent, when the brain is perpetually occupied with external stimulation and social demands, this integrative function is compromised. The emotional residue accumulates without being processed. The sense of self becomes diffuse. The internal signal becomes harder and harder to distinguish from all the noise. This is why many highly empathic people find that extended periods of intensive social engagement, particularly in environments or with people that are energetically demanding, leave them feeling not just tired, but vaguely lost. Not only depleted but somehow less like themselves, less clear about what they think and feel and want and need. This is not a psychological disorder. It is the predictable consequence of a brain that has been denied the integrative self-restorative function that solitude provides. And the prescription is as straightforward as it is difficult to execute in the structure of a modern life. More solitude, more consistently, and with more intentionality than most people have ever practiced. But there is an important distinction between restorative solitude and what might be called reactive isolation. Reactive isolation is withdrawal driven by overwhelm, escaping into a loneliness, not as a deliberate practice of replenishment, but as a flight from the unbearable. It often feels similar in the moment, but produces very different results because it is governed by aversion rather than intention. The person in reactive isolation is still in a sense being driven by the external world. They are organizing their loneliness around what they are running from rather than around what they are returning to. Restorative solitude is different. It is chosen deliberately, structured with at least a minimal degree of intention and oriented towards something, towards stillness, toward clarity, toward contact with one's own inner life rather than simply away from something. The practice of restorative solitude doesn't need to be elaborate. It does need to be protected. This is the part that most people struggle with. Not the desire for solitude, which most depleted people feel acutely, but the practical reality of carving out and defending space for it in a life that perpetually presents urgent alternatives. People who successfully maintain restorative solitude as a consistent practice treat it with the same seriousness they give to other non-negotiable commitments. They do not wait until they have spare time. There is never spare time. They schedule it. They protect it from encroachment, and they take the discomfort of enforcing that protection as the price of their own well-being rather than as evidence that they are being selfish. What you do in solitude matters. Scrolling through your phone in a quiet room is not restorative solitude. It is solo stimulation, and the brain processes it very differently from genuine quiet. True solitude involves some degree of disengagement from external inputs. Time in which your nervous system is not processing incoming information from screens, from social media, from news, from entertainment, but is instead given the space to do its own internal work. Walking in nature, sitting quietly, writing in a journal, meditating, engaging in a slow and absorbing creative practice. These are the kinds of activities that allow the default mode network to do its restorative work. They are activities in which the mind is turned inward rather than outward, in which the self becomes the object of gentle attention rather than the vehicle for processing external demands. There is also a deeper function of solitude that goes beyond nervous system replenishment. Regular time alone is what gives you the best possible access to your own authentic preferences, values, and perspective. Unclouded by the social pressures, conformity tendencies, and emotional contagion that inevitably shape your thinking in the company of others. Research in social psychology has demonstrated repeatedly and across cultures that people in groups think and feel differently than they do alone. That group membership activates conformity pressures. That social environments prime certain thoughts and suppress others, and that individual judgment is reliably altered by social context in ways that people are almost entirely unaware of. The person you are in solitude, what you think, what you value, what you actually want is often a different and more authentically you person than the one navigating social demands in real time. This is why protecting time for solitude is not just about replenishing your energy. It is about maintaining contact with yourself, with the self that exists prior to and beneath all social performance. All accommodation, all unconscious conformity to the emotional atmosphere of whatever room you are in. That self is the one who knows what you actually think. The one who knows what you actually need. The one who can tell the difference between what you want and what someone else has convinced you to want. And without regular protected time in which that self has space to exist and to speak, its voice becomes steadily harder to hear. Drowned out by the noise of everyone else's reality pressing in from every direction. Solitude is not the opposite of connection. It is the condition that makes genuine connection possible. When you emerge from true solitude, rested, clear, grounded, reacquainted with your own signal, you bring something real into your interactions. You bring yourself. And that for the people in your life who are capable of genuine relationship is far more valuable than the version of you that shows up exhausted, diffuse, and merged with everyone else's energy. Your solitude is not an abandonment of others. It is the most important preparation you can make for genuinely being there when it matters. Chapter 11. The Approval Trap. breaking free from the need for other people's validation. There is a hunger that drives more self-betrayal, more compromised boundaries, and more chronic emotional depletion than almost any other force in human psychology. It is not ambition. It is not fear of failure. It is the need for approval. The deep, relentless, often unconscious drive to be seen favorably by other people, to be liked, to be accepted, to avoid being the source of someone else's disappointment or displeasure. This need is so pervasive, so woven into the fabric of how most people operate, that many have never even examined it. It simply feels like being a good person. It simply feels like caring about others. It simply feels like being reasonable, accommodating, and kind. And so the person who is being slowly hollowed out by their own approval seeking never identifies the mechanism. They only feel the exhaustion. To understand why the approval trap is so powerful, you have to understand where it comes from. Human beings are a deeply social species. And throughout the vast majority of our evolutionary history, social belonging was not a psychological preference. It was a survival necessity. To be rejected by your group in the environment in which our ancestors evolved was not merely uncomfortable. It was potentially lethal. The individuals who survived and reproduced were disproportionately those whose nervous systems treated social exclusion as a serious threat, who responded to disapproval, rejection, or conflict with sufficient alarm to motivate rapid and thorough social repair. The result over hundreds of thousands of years is a nervous system that is exquisitely sensitive to signs of social rejection and that is willing to pay enormous costs to avoid it. This is not a flaw. It is an inheritance. But an inheritance that was adaptive in one context can become a liability in another. The threat response your nervous system mounts in the face of disapproval was calibrated for a world in which social exclusion had life or death consequences. It was not calibrated for a world in which the cost of disappointing someone is usually nothing more serious than a moment of awkwardness or a temporary shift in someone's opinion of you. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference. When someone is visibly displeased with you, your amygdala responds with the same urgency it would bring to a genuine survival threat. Your heart rate elevates, your stress hormones spike, your thinking narrows, and the overwhelming priority of your nervous system in that moment becomes one thing. Restore the social connection. Remove the disapproval. Make this person like you again at whatever cost. That cost is almost always paid from your own reserves. You agree to things you don't believe in. You say yes when the entire rest of your being is saying no. You soften, diminish, and qualify your honest perspective until it is acceptable to the person in front of you. You absorb criticism you should deflect. Take responsibility. You should decline and perform emotions you do not feel in order to produce the emotional response in the other person that you have learned they need to see from you. And you do all of this automatically, rapidly, with the practiced efficiency of a nervous system that has been running this program for decades, often before your conscious mind has even registered that it is happening. The first step out of the approval trap is the same as the first step out of every unconscious pattern. Recognition. You cannot address what you cannot see. And seeing your approval seeking requires a particular kind of honesty. The willingness to look clearly at moments in which you have prioritized someone else's comfort over your own truth, someone else's opinion over your own judgment, someone else's reaction over your own integrity. Not to judge those moments, but to acknowledge them, to name what was actually happening, to stop calling yourself abandonment consideration and start calling it what it is. The second step is developing what psychologists call approval independence. Not the denial of your social needs, which are real and legitimate, but the capacity to regulate your sense of safety and self-worth internally rather than depending on external validation for psychological stability. Research in self-determination theory developed by Edward Dye and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester has consistently shown that individuals who rely primarily on intrinsic sources of self-worth, who evaluate themselves based on their own internalized values and standards rather than on the approval and opinions of others, demonstrate significantly greater psychological well-being, more authentic behavior, more stable emotional states, and greater resilience in the face of criticism and disapproval. In other words, the research confirms what wisdom traditions have asserted for millennia. The quality of your relationship with yourself is more foundational to your psychological health than the quality of any external opinion about you. Developing approval independence does not mean becoming impervious to feedback or indifferent to the feelings of others. It means building a sufficiently stable internal reference point that the presence or absence of external approval does not determine your basic sense of okayess. It means being able to feel someone's disappointment without concluding that you have done something wrong. It means being able to hold a position that someone disagrees with without immediately searching for a way to capitulate. It means being able to tolerate being disliked by a specific person in a specific context, without your nervous system treating it as a catastrophe that must be resolved at all costs. This is a profoundly liberating shift. Because here is the truth that the approval trap has kept you from seeing. You cannot make everyone happy. You never could. No matter how much you accommodate, how much you contort yourself, how much of your authentic self you sacrifice on the altar of other people's comfort, there will always be someone who is displeased with you. Always. The people who like you for who you actually are will still like you when you stop performing. The people who only like the performance will be unhappy when you stop. And the question you need to sit with honestly and seriously is which of those relationships you actually want to protect. Because you cannot protect both. And the choice you make in answering that question is in very real terms the choice between your peace and its perpetual absence. Chapter 12. Healing the Open Wound. How unresolved pain makes you energetically vulnerable. There is something that nobody tells you about unresolved emotional pain. They tell you it hurts. They tell you it takes time. They tell you that healing is a journey and that you need to be patient with yourself. But what they rarely tell you with real clarity, with the directness that actually serves you, is that unresolved pain is an open wound in your psychological architecture. And that an open wound does not just hurt. It bleeds. It bleeds your energy, your clarity, and your boundaries. It makes you permeable in ways that a healed version of you would not be. And until you address it, every other strategy for protecting your peace will be operating at a fraction of its potential effectiveness. Because you are trying to defend a structure that is compromised from within. To understand what unresolved pain does to your vulnerability to other people's energy, you need to understand how the nervous system processes threatening emotional experiences. When something genuinely difficult happens, a loss, a betrayal, a humiliation, an experience of abandonment or neglect or violation, your nervous system has a natural process for working through that experience, integrating it, and restoring equilibrium. That process involves feeling the feelings that the experience produced, making meaning of what happened, and gradually updating your internal working models, your deep, largely unconscious beliefs about yourself, about other people, and about the world to incorporate what you have learned. When this process is allowed to complete, when you are safe enough to feel what you need to feel, when you have support and time and the psychological resources to move through the experience rather than around it, something important happens on the other side. The experience becomes part of your history rather than a persistent threat in your present. Your nervous system stops treating it as an ongoing emergency. The emotional charge associated with the memory decreases and your internal resources which were being mobilized to manage the experience are gradually freed up for other things. But most people do not have the safety, the support or the knowledge to allow this process to complete. Instead, they do what humans have always done. When the full weight of an emotional experience is too great to bear, they manage it. They push it down. They get busy. They intellectualize it, minimize it, distract from it, medicate it, or simply decide at some level that it is too dangerous to look at directly and build their life around not looking at it. This management strategy is extraordinarily common and often remarkably effective in the short term. Life goes on. Functioning continues. The pain becomes background noise rather than immediate foreground experience, but it does not go away. The emotional charge of an unprocessed experience remains in the nervous system, stored in the body and in the implicit memory systems of the brain, not as a clear narrative memory, but as a set of triggers, sensitivities, and threat responses that activate automatically when the present moment contains anything that resembles the original wounding experience. This is why certain people affect you with a disproportionate intensity that you cannot quite explain. It is why certain kinds of criticism devastate you while leaving others unaffected. It is why certain tones of voice, certain silences, certain expressions on someone's face can send your nervous system into a state of alarm that the current situation does not fully warrant. You are not overreacting to the present. You are reacting to the present plus the unprocessed past. And the two have merged in your nervous system in ways that are invisible to you but relentless in their influence. This is what makes unresolved pain such a source of energetic vulnerability. Every unhealed wound is a point of entry. Every unprocessed experience is a sensitivity that other people's energy can land on and activate. The person who triggers you most reliably is almost never doing something genuinely extraordinary. They are pressing with perhaps no awareness at all on a place that was injured long before they arrived in your life. And as long as that place remains unhealed, no amount of boundary setting, communication strategy, or protective practice will fully protect you at that point. You can build walls around it. You can learn to manage the trigger response more skillfully. But the wound beneath will remain a source of vulnerability until it is healed. Healing is not a linear process, and it is not one that can be forced, but it is one that can be deliberately engaged. And the most important thing you can do to begin that engagement is to become willing, genuinely, seriously willing to look at what is there. Not to wallow in it, not to make it the center of your entire identity, but to acknowledge it with honesty and with compassion. To stop expending the enormous energy required, to keep it at arm's length, and to begin the process of bringing it into the light where it can actually be seen, felt, and ultimately integrated. For many people, this process is best supported by a skilled therapist, particularly one trained in approaches that address stored emotional experience at the level of the nervous system rather than purely at the level of cognition and narrative. Modalities such as EMDR, somatic experiencing, and internal family systems work have a substantial body of research behind them, demonstrating their effectiveness in resolving the kind of stored traumatic and subtraumatic material that drives chronic emotional vulnerability. This is not a commercial for any approach. It is an honest acknowledgement that some wounds are too complex, too deeply embedded, or too carefully defended to be resolved through insight and self-reflection alone. And that reaching for skilled support in those cases is not weakness. It is intelligence. What healing does for your capacity to protect your peace cannot be overstated. As the wounds close, the points of entry close with them. The triggers lose their hair trigger sensitivity. The emotional charge that other people's behavior can activate in you decreases. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop confusing the present with the past. You stop hearing your father's criticism in your colleague's feedback. You stop feeling your childhood helplessness in your friend's crisis. You stop re-experiencing your old abandonment every time someone is slow to reply. You become increasingly able to respond to what is actually happening right now, with the resources of the adult you have become rather than to what your nervous system has decided is happening based on old information that no longer applies. That freedom, the freedom to be fully present in the present, is one of the most profound gifts that healing can offer you. Chapter 13. Choosing your circle. Building a life with people who replenish rather than deplete. Everything we have discussed in this audiobook. The awareness of emotional contagion, the development of boundaries, the practice of detachment and mental sovereignty, the healing of old wounds, all of it is operating within a context that matters enormously. The specific human beings who populate your daily life. Because the truth is that no amount of internal work will fully compensate for a social environment that is fundamentally hostile to your peace. The strategies in this audiobook are not designed to make you invulnerable to the people around you. They are designed to give you the awareness and the tools to manage the inevitable encounters with difficult energy that life brings. But they are not a substitute for making deliberate, honest choices about who you spend your time with and under what conditions. This chapter is about that choice, and it begins with a confrontation that many people find genuinely uncomfortable. The acknowledgement that not all relationships deserve equal investment. That some people in your life are actively making it harder for you to be the person you want to be. That the social circle you have built up through history, through proximity, through obligation, through inertia, may not be the social circle that serves your actual well-being. And that changing it, while difficult and sometimes painful, is one of the most profound acts of self-help available to you. Let's begin with what research tells us about the impact of our social environment on our psychological health. Because the data here is more dramatic than most people realize. A landmark study by social researcher Nicholas Christeris and political scientist James Fowler, published in the British Medical Journal in 2008, demonstrated something remarkable. Happiness is contagious through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation. The emotional states of your friends and your friends' friends and their friends measurably affect your own emotional experience. More recent research has replicated and extended these findings, showing that not only emotional states, but behaviors, attitudes, health practices, and even longevity are powerfully shaped by the social networks we inhabit. You are not just influenced by the people closest to you. You are in a very real sense partially constructed by them. Who you spend time with shapes who you become, not as a vague inspirational principle but as a documented social and neurological reality. This means that choosing your circle is not a peripheral concern. It is not a nice to have. It is one of the most high-lever decisions you can make about the direction of your life. And yet most people make it barely at all, allowing their social circle to be determined almost entirely by chance. Who they grew up near, who they ended up working with, who happened to enter their life at moments when they were lonely or available or not yet clear enough about themselves to recognize that the connection wasn't nourishing them. The first distinction that matters when you begin evaluating your social circle is between relationships that are reciprocally nourishing and relationships that are consistently directional, in which energy, attention, emotional labor and care consistently flow in one direction from you to the other person with little or nothing flowing back. Directional relationships are not automatically problematic. There are seasons in life when a person genuinely needs more support than they can give, periods of grief, of crisis, of illness, of major transition. During those seasons, the people who love them give more than they receive. And that is not depletion. That is love. What transforms directional relationships into depleting ones is chronicity and pattern. When the imbalance is not a season but a permanent state of affairs. When it is not an exception but the defining structure of the relationship. When the other person's need is so constant and so total that the notion of mutual reciprocity has ceased to be relevant. Honest assessment of which relationships in your life fall into this category requires setting aside 2 things that tend to cloud the evaluation: history and guilt. History says that because you have known someone for a long time, because you have been through significant experiences together, because they were important to you at some earlier point in your life, the relationship has an inherent value that should be maintained regardless of what it currently costs you. Guilt says that evaluating a relationship based on what it gives and takes from you is selfish. That a truly loving person gives unconditionally regardless of the personal cost. Both of these arguments contain just enough truth to be persuasive and just enough distortion to be dangerous. History tells you what a relationship was. It tells you nothing reliable about what it is. And love, real love, mature love, sustainable love is not unconditional in the sense of being without any recognition of your own needs. That is not love. That is self-erasure disguised as virtue. Once you have assessed your circle honestly, you face a set of choices that exist on a spectrum. At one end is the complete removal of a relationship from your life. A decision that is sometimes necessary, particularly in cases of genuine toxicity or abuse. But that is far rarer than our culture of boundary setting sometimes implies. Most difficult relationships do not need to end. They need to be restructured. And restructuring means 3 things. Adjusting the frequency of contact. changing the depth of access you allow and being clear about the specific conditions under which you are and are not available. Frequency is often the most immediately powerful lever. Reducing how often you see or speak to someone who consistently drains you without any dramatic conversation, without an explanation or an ultimatum. Simply by being less available can produce an immediate and significant improvement in your energy and your emotional stability. Depth of access means the degree to which you allow someone into your inner world, how much of your genuine thoughts, feelings, fears, and hopes you share with them. Draining people do not always need to be seen less often. Sometimes they simply need to be kept at a different depth, engaged with at the surface level of daily life rather than at the depths of genuine emotional intimacy that they have consistently demonstrated they cannot honor or hold. At the other end of the spectrum from removal is the active intentional cultivation of nourishing relationships. The deliberate investment of your time and energy in the people who genuinely replenish you. This is the part of circle curation that gets far less attention than it deserves. Most of the conversation around protecting your peace focuses on what to reduce and what to remove. But the goal is not a smaller social life. The goal is a better one. A life populated by people who tell you the truth. Who celebrate your growth without feeling threatened by it. Who bring their own fullness to the relationship rather than their emptiness. Who leave you feeling more like yourself after spending time with them rather than less. These people exist. They may not be in your current circle, but they are findable. And finding them requires the same deliberate intentionality that every other aspect of protecting your peace requires. You will not stumble into the right people while you are too depleted to know what you need or too accommodating to act on what you know. Choose deliberately. Choose with honesty. Choose in alignment with who you are becoming rather than who you used to be. Your circle is not a given. It is a choice, and few choices you make will have a more profound effect on the quality of your daily emotional experience than this one. Chapter 14. The Daily Architecture of Peace: Practical Rituals for an Unshakable Inner World. Everything this audiobook has offered you in terms of understanding the science of emotional contagion, the psychology of boundaries, the practice of detachment, the healing of wounds, the curation of your circle. All of it must eventually be translated into the specific texture of your daily life. Into what you actually do when you wake up in the morning. Into how you structure the hours that belong to you before the demands of the world begin. Into the small recurring choices you make throughout the day about what to give your attention to, what to allow in, and what to let pass. Because peace is not a state you achieve and then maintain effortlessly. It is a state you build and rebuild daily through a set of practices that are simple enough to actually sustain and consistent enough to actually change you. The word ritual might seem too grand for what we are talking about. These are not elaborate ceremonies. They are small repeated actions that carry disproportionate weight, not because of what they accomplish in any single instance, but because of what they build over time. Habits of mind, neural pathways, automatic orientations that gradually shift the default setting of your nervous system from reactive and porous to grounded and sovereign. This is the compounding interest of daily practice. Small deposits made consistently over time produce returns that seem out of proportion to the individual investment. And the opposite is also true. The daily absence of any protective practice compounds into a nervous system that grows progressively less resilient, progressively more susceptible to every passing emotional current in its environment. The first daily practice that research consistently identifies as foundational is morning intentionality. The deliberate structuring of the first portion of your day before the world has had a chance to set your agenda for you. For most people, the morning is a period of maximum vulnerability. The nervous system is in a transitional state between sleep and full waking consciousness. It is not yet fully braced. And in that soft open condition, whatever inputs arrive first have an outsized influence on the tone and quality of the hours that follow. For most people, those first inputs are their phone, a flood of notifications, news, social media, emails, and messages that immediately orient the nervous system toward the external world and its demands, concerns, and conflicts before the person has had a single moment of contact with their own internal state. Reclaiming the morning, even 15 or 20 minutes of it, as a period of internal orientation before external engagement begins, is one of the highest leverage interventions available. What you do in that time matters less than that you do something that is inwardly directed rather than outwardly reactive. Meditation, deliberate breathing, journaling, slow movement, quiet intention setting for the day ahead. Any of these practiced consistently begins to establish a morning baseline of internal groundedness that the rest of the day is layered on top of rather than built directly from the chaos of external input. The research on morning routines and their effects on daily psychological functioning is extensive and consistent. Individuals who begin their day with some form of intentional internal practice report better mood stability, clearer thinking, more effective emotional regulation, and greater resilience across the day's challenges compared to those who begin it by immediately engaging with external demands. The second daily practice is what could be called boundary hygiene. The small recurring acts of noticing and enforcing your emotional limits throughout the day as they arise rather than allowing accumulated violations to build into a crisis. This means noticing in real time when a conversation is beginning to drain you and making a small adjustment, redirecting the topic, excusing yourself gracefully, or simply reducing your level of emotional engagement rather than absorbing the full impact and managing the fallout later. It means checking in with yourself at regular intervals throughout the day. What is my energy level right now? What is my emotional state? Does what I am feeling belong to me or does it feel like something I have absorbed from someone else? These small recurring check-ins build the habit of self-monitoring that is the practical foundation of emotional self-protection because you cannot manage what you have not first noticed. The third daily practice is what neuroscientists and mindfulness researchers call attentional sovereignty. The deliberate management of where you place your attention throughout the day. Your attention is not an infinite resource. It is limited, depletable, and extraordinarily valuable. The single most important factor determining what experiences and information shape your nervous system on a daily basis. And in the current information environment, there are more sophisticated, better funded, more relentless competitors for your attention than at any other point in human history. Every feed algorithm, every notification system, every piece of content designed to provoke an emotional response is competing for the resource of your focused attention. And most of it is competing by activating the same nervous system threat responses, the same urgency, outrage, fear, and social alarm that make you most vulnerable to emotional contagion. Taking back control of your attention does not require abandoning technology or retreating from the world. It requires developing the habit of choosing rather than defaulting, of asking regularly whether what currently has your attention is something you deliberately chose to give it or something that captured it by exploiting your automatic responses. The practice of deliberate attention, of consciously redirecting your focus toward what genuinely matters to you and away from what is simply demanding it most aggressively, is in a very real sense the practice of mental sovereignty made concrete and operational in daily life. The fourth daily practice is what is sometimes called an evening clearing. A brief intentional end-of-day process for releasing the emotional residue of the day before it consolidates overnight. Sleep is the nervous system's primary period of memory consolidation and emotional processing. And the emotional material that is most vivid and most activated at the point of sleep transition has the strongest influence on that consolidation process. Carrying the full emotional weight of a difficult day with its accumulated frustrations, absorbed anxieties and unresolved interpersonal tensions directly into sleep allows that material to be processed in a heightened and sometimes amplified state. What many people call sleeping on a problem and waking up still feeling terrible about it is often this dynamic in action. An evening clearing does not need to be elaborate. It can be as simple as 10 minutes of journaling in which you acknowledge what happened today, including what drained you, what affected you, what you absorbed that wasn't yours, and consciously release it. Some people use a brief physical practice, a short walk or a stretching routine to discharge the tension that has accumulated in the body throughout the day. Others use a deliberate mental practice of setting down what they are carrying, acknowledging that this day is complete, that what belonged to today does not need to be carried into tomorrow, and that the night is a space of restoration rather than a continuation of the day's concerns. Whatever form it takes, the function is the same: to interrupt the automatic carryover of daily emotional residue into the restorative space of sleep so that you wake up the next morning with as much of your own authentic baseline restored as possible. The fifth and perhaps most underestimated daily practice is the deliberate recurring acknowledgement of what is nourishing. Not gratitude in the performative social media sense, but genuine, specific, felt recognition of the people, experiences, and moments in your daily life that restore you, that remind you of who you are, that give you contact with beauty or meaning or genuine human connection. Research in positive psychology, particularly the work of Martin Seligman, Barbara Fredrickson and their colleagues, has established with considerable rigor that positive emotional experiences are not merely pleasant additions to life, but functional resources, that they broaden cognitive and behavioral repertoires, build psychological resilience, and actively counteract the effects of negative emotion and stress. Fredrickson's broaden and build theory proposes, and the evidence supports, that cultivating positive emotional experience is not an escape from the difficulties of life but a direct investment in your capacity to navigate them. Every moment of genuine nourishment. You allow yourself every experience of beauty, connection, laughter, meaning or simple pleasure that you are fully present for rather than rushing through as a deposit into the reserves that difficult moments will draw on. This is not indulgence. This is architecture, and it belongs in your daily practice with the same seriousness you give to everything else. Chapter 15. The life that awaits you. What becomes possible. When you finally protect your peace, there is a version of your life that you have probably glimpsed occasionally and rarely inhabited for long. A version in which you wake up with a genuine sense of your own aliveness rather than a preemptive weariness. In which the day feels like something you are moving through with agency and intention rather than something that is happening to you. In which the people around you feel like companions in life rather than sources of demand that must be managed. In which your inner world, your thoughts, your feelings, your sense of who you are and what matters to you feels genuinely, stably, unreservedly like yours. This is not a fantasy. This is not an ideal reserved for people with easier lives or less complicated histories or some neurological advantage you were not given. This is the life that becomes available when you stop allowing other people's energy to run unchecked through your inner world. And it is worth describing in detail because the clearer you can see where you are going, the more reason you have to do the work it takes to get there. The first and most immediate thing that changes when you genuinely begin to protect your peace is your energy. Not the caffeinated kind, not the motivated kind, the basic cellular waking up and being glad to be alive kind. When your nervous system is no longer spending the majority of its resources processing the absorbed emotional states of everyone around you. When it is no longer running the background programs of chronic hypervigilance, accumulated tension and unprocessed emotional residue that have been its default for years. It has surplus. Resources that were perpetually consumed by the invisible work of emotional absorption are now available for something else. For your own projects, your own joy, your own creative vision, your own relationships with people who genuinely matter to you. The experience of this surplus, when people first begin to really feel it, is often startling. They describe it as feeling lighter than they have in years, as if a weight they had stopped noticing because it had been there so long has been quietly lifted. The second thing that changes is your clarity. One of the most insidious effects of chronic emotional absorption is the cognitive fog it produces. The sense of mental cloudiness, of difficulty thinking clearly, of being perpetually slightly behind yourself. When the prefrontal cortex is no longer perpetually diverted by the regulatory demands of an overwhelmed emotional system, it becomes available for what it is actually designed for. Clear perception, creative thinking, wise decision-making. The kind of long-view perspective that allows you to see your life as a whole rather than just reacting to whichever crisis or demand is most immediately in front of you. People who have genuinely protected their peace report consistently that they think better, that they solve problems more effectively, that they have ideas they did not have before, not because they have become more intelligent, but because the intelligence they always had is no longer running at reduced capacity due to the perpetual tax of emotional dysregulation. The cognitive you that emerges from behind the fog of chronic absorption is often significantly more capable than the one who has been operating in fog for years. The third transformation is in your relationships. This one surprises people because they often assume that protecting their emotional space will make them less connected. That the barriers they build to keep other people's chaos out will also keep genuine intimacy at bay. The opposite is almost universally true. When you stop operating from depletion, when you stop being perpetually resentful of the invisible toll that unprotected contact with others has been taking. When you stop confusing every interaction with a potential source of drain that must be managed or survived, your relationships become fundamentally different in quality. You become genuinely present in them. You have something real to offer rather than the performance of availability from behind the wall of your own exhaustion. The people who are truly worth your time can feel the difference immediately. They are encountering the actual you, not the accommodating, anxiety-managing, boundary-dissolving version, but the grounded, present, honest, warm version that only becomes accessible when your inner world is protected enough to allow it out. And the relationships that could not survive the presence of the real you. The ones that depended on your limitlessness, your unconditional availability, your never saying no and never saying enough and never saying this is costing me more than I have. Those relationships will shift. Some will end not in drama usually but in a kind of quiet dissolution as the dynamic that held them together is no longer available. And this loss, while it can be painful, is not the devastation it might have seemed from inside the old pattern, because those relationships were not nourishing you. They were using you. And the space that opens when something using you is removed is not emptiness. It is room. Room for something different, something real, something mutual, something worth having. The fourth transformation is the one that is hardest to describe, but most often cited by people who have done this work as the most profound. The return of your sense of self. The restoration of the experience of being an individual with your own distinct inner life, your own perspective, your own preferences, your own relationship with your own emotions that is not perpetually mediated and distorted by the emotional weather of everyone around you. This may sound abstract until you consider how long you may have been without it. How many years you have spent not being entirely sure what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually want. Because those questions have been so thoroughly drowned out by the louder, more urgent questions of what everyone else around you thinks and feels and wants from you. The return of your sense of self is not a dramatic event. It accumulates gradually in small moments of unexpected clarity. You find yourself in a conversation and you notice that you have an opinion, a genuine, unpressured, unperformed opinion that is simply yours. You wake up one morning and notice that your first feeling is not dread or preemptive anxiety, but something closer to curiosity about the day. You notice that someone's displeasure with you, which would once have sent your nervous system into emergency mode, registers now as information rather than catastrophe, you noted. You consider whether it deserves a response and you make a choice from your own center rather than from a place of compelled appeasement. These moments accumulate. They become a new baseline, and the person who inhabits that new baseline is not a different person than you have always been. They are the same person finally fully inhabiting their own life. You are allowed to want this. You are allowed to actively pursue it, to take it seriously, to give it the same energy and intention that you have been giving to everyone else for years. In fact, you are not just allowed. You are obligated to yourself to try, because the peace you build inside yourself does not isolate you from the world. It equips you for it. It makes you more genuinely useful to the people who truly matter to you. More capable of making a contribution that is real and sustained rather than performed and depleted. More fully alive to the extraordinary particularity of your own existence. Other people's energy will always be present. The world will always contain difficulty, chaos, pain, and people who carry more than they can manage without some of it spilling onto you. You cannot control that, but you can control your inner world, its depth, its stability, its resilience, its capacity to remain yours, even when everything outside it is demanding that you give it away. That control is not cold. It is not selfish. It is not a rejection of love or of human connection. It is the foundation of everything meaningful you will ever offer the world. And it begins as all things of genuine importance begin with the decision to take it seriously. Your peace is yours. Protect it as if everything that matters depends on it. Because it does.